The Blind Spot Between Us by Gleb Tsipursky is a thoughtful and urgent exploration of how cognitive biases silently sabotage our relationships, with friends, partners, family, and colleagues, despite our best intentions. The book begins with the story of two longtime friends who suddenly fall out over what seemed like a minor disagreement. Neither of them fully understands what went wrong. This emotional anecdote draws readers into the core premise of the book, that the true threats to our relationships aren't always visible conflicts, but the hidden mental patterns we carry into every interaction. Tsipursky introduces the concept of cognitive blind spots as the unseen drivers behind miscommunication, mistrust, and unintended harm. These blind spots, rooted in the same biases that distort our decision-making, take on a more intimate and personal dimension in the social sphere. Anchoring the narrative in both psychological science and everyday scenarios, the author shows how these biases quietly influence how we interpret tone, body language, and even the intentions of those we care about most. One early chapter explores the fundamental attribution error through a couple's recurring arguments. When one partner forgets an anniversary, the other assumes it's because of carelessness or a lack of love, rather than considering stress or forgetfulness. Tsipursky walks readers through how we often see our own actions as products of circumstance while judging others based on perceived character flaws. He invites us to pause and ask, what else might be true, before reacting. Another example comes from the workplace, where a team member misreads a colleague's silence in meetings as disapproval. In reality, the colleague is simply anxious about speaking up. This story introduces the bias blind spot. The tendency to believe that others are biased while we are objective. Tsipursky suggests exercises in perspective-taking, like looping for understanding, where one summarizes the other person's viewpoint to their satisfaction before responding. This technique, he says, helps diffuse misunderstanding before it snowballs. The book's strength lies in how it makes the science deeply personal. The availability heuristic, for example, is explained through a young woman who begins to fear abandonment in all her relationships after one painful breakup. Because the emotional memory is so vivid, it dominates her interpretations of later experiences. Tsipursky encourages readers to challenge emotional reasoning with reality checks. What is most likely, not most memorable? Tsipursky also delves into confirmation bias within romantic partnerships. He shares the story of a man who begins to believe his partner no longer loves him, and from that point forward, interprets every neutral gesture, missed texts, quiet evenings, small disagreements, as further proof. The author demonstrates how we become detectives for the evidence we expect to find. The antidote, he argues, is learning to actively look for disconfirming evidence and to build in regular, bias check-ins, within close relationships. He doesn't shy away from deeper issues, such as how implicit racial or cultural biases affect cross-group relationships. In one chapter, a black employee finds himself constantly interrupted during meetings, while his white coworkers are unaware of the pattern. Tsipursky guides readers through how privilege can function as a blind spot, not because of ill intent, but because of unfamiliarity. He challenges readers to proactively invite feedback and remain open to being corrected without collapsing into defensiveness. In a moving section on family dynamics, he recounts the story of a woman whose parents never say, "I love you," but instead show affection through practical help. At first, she sees their silence as emotional distance, until a therapist helps her recognize a cultural bias toward verbal expression. This chapter highlights how expectation bias, projecting our own norms onto others, can cause pain where there is, in fact, quiet care. The lesson: love languages are diverse, and understanding them requires curiosity, not assumption. Tsipursky explores groupthink and the dangers of social conformity through a story of friends who go along with a toxic group dynamic rather than challenge the leader. By illuminating the subtle fear of social rejection, he shows how people often suppress their true thoughts, leading to fractured trust and internal resentment. His solution is the cultivation of psychological safety, spaces where honesty is invited, not punished. A recurring theme is the power of slow thinking in fast-moving conversations. One anecdote describes a manager who uses a 10-second pause rule before responding in emotionally charged meetings. The simple act of pausing creates space for empathy, clarity, and connection. Szyperski encourages readers to build similar microhabits to check their impulses and notice when bias is trying to take the wheel. The book doesn't offer magic solutions but gives readers a roadmap for navigating bias in real time. In moments of tension, Szyperski advises using structured reflection questions. What emotions am I feeling? What am I assuming? What story am I telling myself? What else could be true? These serve as anchors in emotionally stormy waters and gradually train the brain to recognize distorted thinking before damage is done. In a touching chapter on reconciliation, he describes a mother and daughter estranged for years due to miscommunication and assumption. When both learn to speak vulnerably, take responsibility for past assumptions, and acknowledge their own blind spots, they find common ground. This section emphasizes that repairing relationships requires not only honesty but also a willingness to see ourselves as part of the problem. Importantly, the blind spot between us doesn't preach perfection. Szyperski reminds readers that bias is part of being human and that no one will ever eliminate it entirely. The goal is not to become unflawed, but to become aware, and in that awareness, to become more compassionate communicators and more emotionally intelligent allies. He emphasizes the communal aspect of bias work. Just as bias thrives in silence and isolation, it shrinks in dialogue and reflection. He shares stories of workplaces, families, and friend groups that build rituals for checking assumptions, celebrating perspective shifts, and cultivating accountability. The result, he argues, is not just fewer conflicts but deeper, more authentic relationships. The final message of the book is one of hope. While cognitive blind spots will always exist, they don't have to define or derail our most important connections. With awareness, humility, and practice, we can bridge the invisible gaps that separate us. Not by pretending we are perfectly fair, but by embracing our imperfect humanity and doing the daily work of seeing each other more clearly. The blind spot between us isn't just about relationships, it's a call to build a culture of courageous curiosity.